The torches took 4 full seconds to vanish into that darkness below us. 4 full seconds before the light was simply gone, and I knew then that we had not broken through into any cave that God or geology had made. I have carried that knowledge, and what came after it, for 40 years, and I am putting it down now, because I will not be putting anything down much longer. My name is Elias Cruff. I was 31 years old in the autumn of 1802, and I was the foreman of a 5-man prospecting crew working the basin country east of the Humboldt Range in what was then barely mapped territory. I say barely mapped because that is generous. The charts we had were scratched by men who had passed through fast and wanted to keep passing. Nobody had spent a winter out there. Nobody had gone deep into the rock formations along the southern lip of the basin, where the calcite shelves stacked up like the pages of a book, pressed flat by some enormous weight. That is where we were working. That is where it happened. The other men deserve their names, said aloud. Even now, even at this point. Jonas Pell was my second, a stonemason by original trade, who had drifted west, looking for silver, and found mostly hard luck. He was a broad, quiet man of 43, who understood rock the way some men understand horses, by feel as much as by reason. Corvin Marsh was our youngest, 22, from somewhere east of the Missouri I never pinned down, fast with a pick and faster with an opinion. Thomas Red and Samuel Loy rounded us out. Experienced desert men, both of them, the kind who carry water like a religion and do not talk much until they have a reason. They were good men. I want that said plainly, and I want it understood before anything else is. We had been working that basin shelf for 11 days before the floor gave way. I should describe the country for whoever is receiving this recording, because the landscape matters to what I am about to tell you. The basin east of the Humboldt Range in autumn is a place of tremendous cold at night and brutal retained warmth from the stone during the day. The rock there is pale, almost cream-colored, shot through with veins of calcite and silica that catch the low sun and throw it back at you. The ground rings when you strike it in certain places, a high, clean note, as if the material below is hollow or under compression. We had noted this and taken it as a promising sign. Hollow ground means cavities. Cavities mean water or mineral deposit channels. Either one was worth following. Jonas had been pointing at a particular section of shelf for 3 days before we committed to it. He said the resonance was wrong for a simple pocket cavity. He could not say what it was right for. He just said wrong, and when Jonas Pell said a piece of ground was wrong, you listened, because his instincts had pulled us clear of 2 bad collapses on the previous survey. I told him to mark it, and we would open a test shaft on the 11th day. I need to tell you about the warmth before I describe what happened next, because the warmth was the first thing, and it was strange before anything else was strange. When we hit the shelf at about 8 feet down, the air coming up out of the hairline fractures in the calcite changed. In a cold desert basin in late October, with night temperatures that would freeze standing water by midnight, the air rising from a crack in the earth should be cool to cold. Stone holds cold the way clay holds water. Instead, what came up from those fractures was warm, not hot, not unpleasant, but warm, as if someone had been burning a fire in a well-sealed room somewhere far below, and the heat had found its way up through the stone over the course of hours. I put my hand over the longest crack, and I felt it clearly. There was no question about it. The warmth was real, and it was rising. Jonas looked at me, and I looked at Jonas, and neither of us said what we were both thinking, which was that warm, rising air in compressed stone is one of the indicators of geothermal activity. But geothermal activity does not explain dressed stone walls, and we did not know that yet. We only knew the warmth. We widened the shaft and kept going. The shelf broke at 14 feet. It did not crumble the way calcite usually does, with a gradual spalling and loosening. It broke all at once, a single plate the width of 3 men lying end to end, and it dropped cleanly away from our tools, as if it had been waiting for the right pressure point. The torches we had wedged in the shaft wall above us threw their light down into the gap, and I watched it fall. 4 seconds. I counted them then, and I have counted them 10,000 times since. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the light from those torches was just gone, swallowed by a darkness below us that had depth in it the way an ocean has depth, a quality to it, not just an absence of light, but a presence of its own kind of weight. We did not speak for a long moment. Corvin made a sound that was not quite a word. Jonas crouched at the edge of the gap and held his hand into it, and then looked up at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. He said, "It's warm all the way down." We rigged the descent rope against the solid stone above the break, and I went first. The drop was 40 feet, near as we could measure by the rope. The walls of the natural shaft were ordinary stone for the upper 20 feet, fractured and irregular, exactly what you would expect. And then they changed. At 20 feet down, without transition, without any sign of natural weathering, the walls became dressed, smooth, straight, carved by tools that had been worked with a precision that our own tools could not have matched at speed. The stone they were cut from was different too. Darker, denser, with a surface quality under the fingers that was almost waxy, as if it had been treated with something that had long since soaked in and become part of the material itself. I ran my hand along it as I descended, and it felt like touching the side of a very large, very still animal. That was the thought I had. I did not chase it away. I let it sit there and kept going. When I hit the floor, the heat hit me fully. It was not oppressive. It was not the heat of a mine where bad air collects and the lungs labor. It was clean heat, steady, and it was coming from below, from the floor itself, through the soles of my boots. I stood still for a moment, just feeling it, because it was not at all what a man expects to feel when he descends into the earth. And then, under the heat, there was something else. Something I felt before I understood I was feeling it. A vibration, very faint, very slow. I thought at first it was the rope above me, the tension of the other men's weight as they began their own descent. But it was not coming from the rope. It was coming from the floor. A deep pulse, regular, rhythmic, felt only through the boots and up through the legs. Like standing on a drum someone is beating very slowly in a room a long distance away. I looked down the corridor, because that is what it was. Not a cave, not a rough cavity, a corridor. Arrow straight in both directions, wider than 2 wagons placed side by side, with a ceiling high enough that I could not determine its limit in the torchlight. The floor was worn smooth in a path down its center, smooth in the way stone gets smooth when countless feet have crossed it over countless years, a bowl-shaped wear pattern that spoke of immense time and immense traffic. And it ran straight, both ways, as far as my torch carried any light at all. I want to be exact about this because I understand how it sounds to anyone who was not standing there. The walls were dressed. The floor had been worn by use. The corridor ran straight. In the formation east of the Humboldt Range, inside a calcite shelf at the floor of a desert basin, in the year of our Lord 1802, we were standing in a hallway that someone had built. Jonas came down the rope behind me and stood beside me for a long time without speaking. Corvin came after, and when his boots touched the floor, he let out a long breath and said nothing. Red and Loy came last, and when all 5 of us were standing in that corridor, with our torches held up, the shadows from the dressed walls moving slowly as we turned to look in each direction, Loy said quietly that he thought we should go back up. He did not say it with fear in his voice. He said it the way a careful man states an observation. Nobody moved toward the rope. I told them we would go in one direction for 30 minutes by the clock, mark the passage every 50 feet, and return. We would make notes. We would not touch anything. We would not take anything. Those were the rules I laid down, and I laid them down clearly. I have spent 40 years returning to that moment and asking myself whether they were the right rules or whether the right rule would have been the one Loy suggested, which was to go back up and never come back down. I cannot answer that question anymore. I gave up trying to answer it some years ago because it serves no purpose now. We went south. I had a compass, and south was the direction where the corridor showed slightly more wear on the floor, as if that direction had seen more use, which seemed to indicate that something of interest lay farther that way. I noted the warmth increasing as we moved. Not sharply, not dramatically, but consistently, the way temperature rises when you move toward a furnace rather than away from one, and the vibration in the floor increased with it. By the time we were 200 yards in, the pulse beneath my boots was noticeably stronger, and I found myself adjusting my gait slightly, unconsciously, as if I were trying to step between the beats rather than on them. The first alcoves appeared at the 300-yard mark. They were cut into the walls at regular intervals, about 8 feet apart, each one recessed perhaps 2 feet into the stone. They were roughly 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall, and their back walls were smooth and flat, in a way that the corridor walls were not, as if the alcoves had been prepared with particular care. Most were empty, but not all. Some contained objects that I will describe only in general terms because I am not certain enough of what I saw to be more specific, and I was trained, by a career in the extraction trades, to report only what I am certain of. There were bowls. There were shapes that might have been representations of things I did not recognize. There were marks cut into the back walls of several alcoves, repeating patterns of spirals and channels. The same spiral and channel pattern, repeated with a precision that suggested it was not decorative but instructional, or perhaps devotional. I recognized the pattern even then, because we would see it again. Corvin reached into the first alcove that held anything, and I told him not to. He pulled his hand back and gave me a look that meant he thought I was being overcautious. He may have been right. He may have been wrong. I have thought about it many times. We pressed south for 20 more minutes, marking the walls with chalk at the intervals I had established, and then the corridor opened. There is no other word for what happened to the space around us. It opened, the way a narrow river opens when it reaches a wide valley, and we were standing in a chamber. The walls fell back on either side, to distances our torches could not reach. The ceiling vaulted upward into a darkness that absorbed our light entirely. The floor continued its smooth, worn surface, but it widened, fanning out in a great circle, whose outer edge we could only partially see, and at the center of that circle, visible even from where we stood at the entry point, was the column. It was not a natural formation. It was carved, or it had been formed by some process we did not understand, into a roughly cylindrical shape about 12 feet across, and it rose from the floor to a height I could not determine because it simply kept going up into the dark. Its surface was covered in the same spiral channel pattern we had seen in the alcoves, but here the scale was larger, the channels deeper, and the stone they were cut into was the same dark, waxy material as the corridor walls, magnified, as if this column were the source of the material and the walls were an extension of it. The heat was significant in that room. Not dangerous, not suffocating, but present, unmistakably and intentionally present, the kind of heat that has a source very nearby, and the vibration in the floor had risen to a point where it was occupying a specific part of my awareness. Not just a background sensation, but something I was tracking, the way you track a distant sound that might be getting closer. I would say it was then, standing at the entrance to that chamber, that the vibration first felt to me less like a geological phenomenon, and more like something else. I did not name it then. I will name it now. It felt like a pulse, a heartbeat, coming from below the floor. Steady, deep, and regular, in a way that no geological process I had ever encountered is regular. Jonas stood beside me, and I heard him exhale slowly. He said, "This is not natural." It was the most comprehensive statement anyone made about that chamber. We moved to the column. The heat was concentrated near it, radiating from it in a way that was inconsistent with the surrounding stone temperature, as if the column had its own thermal source or was conducting heat up from somewhere far below through its mass. I put my hand on it, and it was warm to the touch. noticeably warmer than the air around it, and the vibration was stronger there, coming up through the stone of the column itself, as well as through the floor, so that when I held my palm flat against the surface, I could feel the pulse in my hand, as well as in my feet. I stood there for a moment, and counted the intervals between pulses, 1 beat every 3 seconds, approximately, steady, unwavering. I should have moved us out then. I have told myself this many times. The facts were all present, the warmth increasing, the vibration rising, the impossibility of the construction around us, the alcoves with their contents, the worn floor, all of it speaking the same language to anyone willing to read it, which was that this space was not abandoned, that this space had been in use, that whatever had used it had not necessarily stopped using it simply because it was not in evidence at the moment we arrived. But I did not move us out. I moved us around the column. The alcoves in the great chamber were larger than those in the corridor. They were cut into the curved outer wall at wider intervals, and they were taller, coming to about chest height on a standing man, and they were deeper, extending perhaps 4 feet back into the wall. Most of them contained nothing, or nothing that appeared to be of value, but the alcove at the southern end of the chamber, directly opposite the corridor entrance through which we had come, contained the disc. I saw it before anyone else did. My torch reached it first because I was walking the perimeter ahead of the others, running my hand along the wall and counting the alcoves and noting the spiral marks in each one. The disc was set into a recessed mount in the back wall of the alcove, flush with the stone, and fitted so precisely into its mount that it appeared at first to be part of the wall itself. It was flat, circular, roughly the width of a dinner plate if a dinner plate were made of obsidian glass, and its surface was covered in the same spiral channel pattern we had been seeing. But here the channels were cut deeper, and they caught the torchlight differently, directing it in a way that made the surface appear to move under the light, the spirals seeming to shift their direction, depending on the angle from which you looked at them. The smell reached me a moment after I noticed the disc, faint, distinctive, unmistakable to anyone who had worked in any trade that required the boiling down of animal fat, which most trades in that era did, rendered fat, not rancid, not stale, but present, as if whatever had been used to treat the disc had never fully evaporated from the deep channels, but had simply gone quiescent in the cool air of the chamber. I looked at it for a long time without touching it. I was thinking about what I had told the men. We do not take anything. I was thinking about the alcove design, which was clearly a mount, clearly a display, clearly a deliberate placement of a deliberate object in a deliberate location. I was thinking about the warmth and the pulse under my feet. I was thinking about Jonas saying, "This is not natural." I have gone over and over that moment. What I finally arrived at, standing there in the heat of that enormous underground chamber with the pulse of the floor running up through my legs, was that the disc was a significant object. And that significant objects, when encountered in unmapped territory, were the kind of evidence that justified the entire enterprise, the cost of the expedition, the months of planning, the physical hardship. All of it came to a point in the finding of something like this. It was the logic of the trade. Find something worth finding, and bring it out. That was the work. I pried the disc from its mount. It required more force than I expected. The mount was not secured with any fastening I could identify, no peg or pin or adhesive that I could see. It simply required pressure, the same way a stone fitted precisely into a dry-laid wall requires pressure to remove, even when there is nothing actively holding it. I worked the edge with my knife, felt the seal loosen, and then the disc came free, and the moment it came free, the warmth in the chamber increased sharply, and the vibration in the floor changed. That is the only word I have for it. Changed. Not louder, not stronger, though both of those things were also true. Changed in character, changed in the way a sound changes when the source of it becomes aware of you. It had been a pulse. Steady, passive, impersonal, the kind of rhythm you might ascribe to geology if you were determined to. And then, in the moment the disc came out of its mount, it became something directed, something with intention, The floor beneath my boots did not vibrate the same way after that moment. It pressed upward. Each pulse was now pressing upward against the soles of my feet rather than passing through them, and the regularity of it had shifted, from the long, slow beat of something dormant to the shorter, sharper rhythm of something that had opened its eyes. Corvin said something behind me, a short sound, surprise. Then Loy shouted. I turned. The corridor we had entered from was still open, still visible from where I stood. But at its entrance, at the point where the corridor met the chamber, the floor had changed. Not structurally, not visually. You could not see anything different in the torchlight. But the vibration coming from that point was distinct from the vibration everywhere else in the chamber, localized, concentrated, as if something had settled its weight over that spot from below and was pressing up through it. And the air in the corridor had changed. The warmth that had been consistent throughout our descent had, in the direction of the corridor leading back toward our ascent rope, become noticeably, specifically, pressingly warmer. Not warmer the way a room gets warmer when a fire is built in it. Warmer the way a room gets warmer when something warm and large moves through it and displaces the air. We ran. I am not embarrassed to say that. A man who would not have run at that moment would have been a fool. We ran, and I ran with the disc in my hands, which was a decision I made without full awareness of making it. The disc simply did not leave my grip when my legs started moving. We ran back up the corridor, and I counted the chalk marks on the walls as we passed them, and I will tell you that the vibration in the floor ran with us, paced us, the pulse under our boots matching our stride and then exceeding it, so that the floor felt like it was getting harder and more insistent under each footfall, pushing us, which is possibly the most disturbing physical sensation I have ever experienced, and I have been in 2 mine collapses. We reached the rope in what felt like 4 minutes, but may have been less. Corvin went up first, then Red, then Loy. Jonas was on the rope when we heard the first sound from the corridor behind us. I need to be careful here, because I do not want to claim more than I can accurately attest to. We had not heard any sound before that moment. The entire encounter had been silent except for us. The vibration had been felt, not heard. The changed air had been felt, not heard. The increase in heat had been felt, not heard. The first and only sound was a grinding of stone, deep, continuous, and directional, coming from the southern end of the corridor, behind the chamber we had just left, as if something very large was moving through the stone itself at depth, or as if the stone was moving to accommodate something very large moving through it. It lasted approximately 7 seconds, and then it stopped. Then the floor pulse stopped. Just stopped. Cut off cleanly, the way a sound stops when its source is covered rather than when it fades naturally. 1 beat, a pause, and then nothing. The warmth in the corridor remained. The dressed walls remained, but the pulse was gone, and its absence was as loud as anything I have ever not heard. I was the last one up the rope. We gathered at the surface in the last light of the afternoon and stood there for a time without speaking. The disc was in my hands. I had not been aware of holding it during the ascent, but there it was, and it was warm, warmer than the ambient air. Warm in the way a stone pulled from near a fire is warm, retaining heat from below. I turned it over, and the spiral channels caught the last of the sunlight and threw it in directions that did not correspond to the angle I was holding it at. A trick of the carving. It had to be. But it was unsettling to see in open air after the darkness below. Jonas was looking at me. He was looking at the disc. He said, "You took it." I told him that I had. I told him it was evidence. I told him it was what justified the survey. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he looked away, which was Jonas's way of saying that he disagreed but did not see a productive argument in the near future. We made camp 400 yards from the shaft. I did not want to go further in the dark. That was a decision I have also revisited, and I will not dwell on it here, except to say that the remainder of the night was uneventful. I slept poorly. The disc was in my blanket roll, and it was warm against my back all night long, warmer than the ambient temperature, warmer than it should have been after hours in the cold night air of a desert October. I kept telling myself it had retained the heat from the chamber. Stone retains heat, that is a fact. I kept telling myself that. The vibration did not return that night. The ground was ordinary ground. The silence was ordinary silence. We held council at sunrise. This is the part I have to tell carefully, because the events that followed directly from our decisions at that council are the events I will carry to whatever is waiting for me after this recording ends, and I want the sequence of it to be accurate. I want whoever hears this to understand not just what happened, but how it happened, which is to say, how choices lead to consequences, and how consequences do not always announce themselves as consequences at the time. The question before us was simple. We had found what appeared to be a significant underground structure of unknown origin. We had retrieved one artifact, the disk, which was physical evidence of the structure's construction and use. The question was whether to go back down. Loy said no. He said it clearly and without qualification, which was unusual for Loy, who tended to speak in conditions and probabilities. He said that what he had felt in the chamber was not something he was willing to go back toward, and that the disk should be left at the surface in exchange for not returning, which was a sentence that carried an implication I chose not to examine closely at the time. Corvin said yes. He said we had barely scratched the surface of what was down there, that the chamber we had found had more than one corridor leading out of it, that we had not gone north in the main corridor at all, that whatever we had felt was probably geothermal, and we had startled ourselves with our own ignorance, and that we could be standing on the most significant find in the history of the Western Territories if we had the nerve to go back down and document it properly. Jonas said nothing for a long time, and then said that if we went back down, we should go prepared to leave quickly, and we should not take anything else. Red sided with Corvin, though with less certainty. He said he had felt the same things the rest of us had, and he did not have an explanation for them, but that an unexplained thing was not the same as a dangerous thing, and that we were there to find what there was to find. I sided with Jonas in terms of caution, and with Corvin in terms of return. I told them we would go back down. We would go north this time. We would take full notes and nothing else, and we would come up before dark. I also told them that I was bringing the disk back down to its mount and replacing it. This was not entirely honest. I said it to reduce the tension around Loy's objection and to frame the second descent as a correction of the first day's mistake, rather than a further incursion. In fact, I had no clear intention of replacing the disk. I told myself that I would make that decision once I was down and could assess the situation with full information. That was the rationalization I was using, and I knew it was a rationalization as I was making it. I am not proud of that. We went back down at mid-morning of the 12th day. The warmth started at the same depth as before, at the calcite shelf line, rising from below with that same steady quality that I have never been able to adequately describe, except to say that it felt aware of us. The corridor was unchanged. The chalk marks were where we had left them. The column in the great chamber stood where it had stood, and the alcove where the disk had been was empty, the mount recessed into the wall and dark without the disk in it. But the pulse in the floor was already present when we landed at the bottom of the rope. That was different from the day before. The day before, we had been down for several minutes, well down the corridor and approaching the chamber, before I had become clearly aware of the vibration. Now it was present at the base of the rope. Waiting was the word that came to me, which I pushed away immediately. I had the disk in my pack. I had not taken it out. I felt its warmth through the canvas as we stood there. We went north. The north corridor was similar in construction to the south. Dressed stone walls, worn center path, alcoves at intervals, warmth rising steadily from the floor. But the northern alcoves were different from the southern ones in one respect. The objects in them, where objects were present, were arranged with what appeared to be intentionality relative to each other rather than within the individual alcoves. I mean that the contents of Alcove 3 seemed to be in relationship with the contents of Alcove 4, as if they were a sequence rather than separate placements. Jonas noticed this before I did, and spent a long time at each alcove, comparing what he saw in one with what he saw in the next, moving back and forth, not touching anything. He had a cloth-bound notebook, a professional habit he had maintained from his masonry days, and he was making sketches with a charcoal pencil. I was glad he was doing it. Somebody needed to be recording what we were seeing, and my attention was elsewhere. My attention was on the floor. The vibration was rising faster today than it had yesterday. We had been in the north corridor for perhaps 20 minutes, and the pulse was already at the intensity it had reached in the great chamber the previous day. I kept thinking about this. I kept thinking about what it meant that the pulse was stronger sooner, and whether that was a function of the specific corridor we were in, or whether it was a function of something else, something responsive, something that had registered our return and was responding to it with a different calibration than it had used for first contact. I did not say this to the others. There was no productive purpose in saying it. We came to a second chamber at the 400-yard mark in the north corridor. It was smaller than the great chamber, more regular in shape, lower ceilinged, and where the great chamber had the column at its center, this chamber had a flat floor with a depression cut into it, roughly circular, about 6 feet across and perhaps a foot deep, with the same spiral channel pattern covering its interior surface. The depression was dry and clean. Whatever it had been designed to hold, it was not holding it now. I looked at it for a long time. Then I looked at the disc in my pack. Jonas was looking at me. He said nothing, but he was looking at the disc. I told them we would catalogue the chamber and continue north if the corridor continued. Corvin said yes, the corridor continued. He had already walked ahead 30 feet, and it kept going. Red and Loy began making notes. Jonas kept looking at me. The vibration was now at a level I need to describe carefully, because I want to be accurate, and I do not want to be dramatic about it, though in retrospect, I may have been insufficiently dramatic in my reactions at the time. The pulse was coming up through my boots in regular 3-second intervals, as before, but the amplitude of it had increased to the point where it was no longer only felt in the feet and legs. I was feeling it in my sternum. A resonance, faint but present, a sympathetic vibration in the bones of the chest, as if the pulse from below had reached a frequency that corresponded to something in my own physical structure. I could see from the way Corvin was pressing his hand to his ribs that he was feeling it too, though he did not remark on it. And the warmth in this chamber was a degree beyond the warmth in the corridor. Not uncomfortable, not threatening, but specific, directional. It pressed against the front of my body more than the back, which should be impossible in an enclosed stone room where the heat is radiating from all walls equally, and yet that was what I felt. A warmth with a direction, pressing toward me from the center of the room, from the direction of the depression in the floor. I reached into my pack and took out the disc. I am going to say that I intended to put it in the depression. I am going to say that clearly, and ask you to take it as honest testimony, because it is the closest I can come to the truth of what I was thinking at that moment, which was that the disc belonged somewhere in this system of chambers and corridors, that we had disturbed its placement, and that placing it in the depression in this chamber, where its spiral channels matched the spiral channels cut into the depression's interior, was the logical act of restoration. I had told the men that I would return it to its mount. I was returning it to what I believed was a matching mount. Jonas said, "Elias." Just that, my name. I looked at him. He shook his head once. I put the disc back in my pack. To this day I cannot tell you with certainty whether replacing the disc in that depression would have changed what happened next. The argument I have made to myself over 40 years is that we had already committed the original trespass by removing it, that whatever responded to that removal had already been engaged, and that replacing it in a different location than its original mount might have made no difference, or might have made things worse. Jonas's instinct was that we should not place anything, not touch anything further, not commit to any additional action until we understood what we were dealing with. He was probably right. He was usually right about such things. But I did not follow his instinct fully, because the disc was still in my pack, and not in the mount where I had found it. We spent another 30 minutes in the north chamber. Corvin wanted to push further north. I told him no, and I told him we were going back to the south corridor to check the chamber there before ascending. He objected but followed. The walk back through the main corridor was different from the walk down. I need to say this carefully. Nothing visibly changed. The walls were the same. The worn floor was the same. The chalk marks were where we had left them. The torchlight showed us nothing new. But the warmth had increased throughout the corridor to the point where I was sweating inside my coat, and the vibration in the floor had reached a sustained intensity that I can only describe by saying it had become impossible to ignore. Not because it was painful, because it was rhythmic. Because a rhythm, sustained and regular, does something to the human mind over time that a random or irregular sensation does not do, and what it does is force your body to synchronize with it against your will, the way music forces your foot to move. My pulse had matched it. I had not chosen for my pulse to match it, but it had. 3-second intervals, and my heart was beating in them. I noticed this, and it frightened me more than anything I had seen or felt in that place, more than the construction of the corridors, more than the depth of the chamber, more than the absence of any explanation for any of it. Because a place does not make your heart beat in its rhythm unless it is doing something to you, or unless your body recognizes something about the rhythm and responds to it from some depth below conscious thought. And neither of those explanations left a man in a comfortable position. We were 50 yards from the great chamber when the partial collapse happened. I have gone over the mechanics of it many times, and I am still not entirely certain of the sequence. What I know is this: the floor in the section of corridor behind us, the section we had just walked through coming from the north chamber, gave way in a section approximately 20 feet long. It did not fall, it pressed, downward, with a grinding sound that was not the sharp crack of a structural failure, but the slow, deliberate grinding of stone being moved by something working against it from below. The floor section dropped 6 inches in the front and 12 in the back, and then held, subsided, a new stable level, and the corridor behind us had a step down in it where the flat floor had been, and from below the new crack at the rear edge of the subsided section came a wave of heat that was the most intense we had felt, enough to push us forward in our tracks instinctively. Nobody was on the subsided section when it moved. We had all already passed it. The timing of that would, in the months after, become a subject I turned over repeatedly without reaching a comfortable conclusion. We were in the south corridor now, between the subsidence behind us and the great chamber ahead of us, and the corridor ahead of us was intact, and the ascent rope was at the far end of it, but we would have to pass through the great chamber to reach it. Corvin said we needed to go now, Loy agreed. Red was already moving. Jonas was looking back at the subsided section. He said it was not a structural failure. He said it in his flat, professional way, as a statement of technical assessment, not as alarm. He said the crack profile was wrong and the direction of movement was wrong for a standard collapse, that what he was seeing in the fractured edge was consistent with applied pressure from below, which in his experience as a stonemason meant a mechanism or a force, not a gravity failure. He looked at me and he said we should not be here. I told everyone to move. We entered the great chamber. The column was unchanged. The alcoves were unchanged. The disk's empty mount in the southern alcove was unchanged. But the floor of the chamber was wrong in a way I noticed before I could articulate it. The wear pattern in the center of the chamber floor, the smooth, worn path that indicated generations of use, was damp, not wet, not flooded. Damp in the way a stone surface gets damp when something warm and humid has recently been across it, or when something warm enough to cause condensation in the cooler stone has recently been resting on it. The damp path ran from the chamber's northern entrance, which was not the north corridor we had used, but a second, larger opening on the far side of the column that we had not fully explored, across the chamber floor, and to a point approximately 10 feet from the disk's empty mount. It stopped there, as if whatever had made it had come to that point and paused, and then not continued. The vibration in the floor of the chamber was the strongest it had been anywhere in the system. Not painful, not violent, but now unambiguously, undeniably rhythmic in a way that every one of us was feeling in our chests rather than only in our feet. And the intervals had shortened slightly, from 3 seconds to something closer to 2.5, an acceleration, the way a pulse accelerates when effort is being made. Red was already moving around the column toward the north corridor entrance where our rope was, which was the only exit we knew and trusted. Loy was behind him. Corvin was behind Loy. Jonas stopped at the edge of the damp trail and crouched to examine it, pressing 2 fingers to the stone, and then looking at them, and then looking at me. "Recent," he said. I told him to move. We were all in the north corridor and moving fast toward the rope when the second collapse happened. This one was not partial. This one was complete. Approximately 40 feet ahead of us, between our position and the rope, the floor of the north corridor dropped away, a section of perhaps 30 feet, and it did not press gradually downward the way the first section had. It fell, completely, into darkness, with a sound that was enormous and that echoed back from the void below in a way that told us very clearly there was a space of significant size directly below the corridor at that point. The drop opened a gap in the corridor floor that could not be crossed by any jump. The stone of the gap's edges was sharp and fresh, not worn, not dressed, simply broken, a structural failure of the floor itself over whatever lay below it. We had no rope. The rope had been on the far side of the collapse. We stood at the edge of the gap and looked across it, and Corvin said something that I will not repeat here because it served no purpose then and serves no purpose now. The vibration in the floor at that point was continuous, not pulsing anymore, continuous. A sustained pressure from below, the way a hand presses flat against a surface rather than tapping it, and the heat was significant. The new edge of the floor gap throwing heat up from below, as if the space beneath it was considerably warmer than the corridor we were standing in, which it was. Whatever was below us was warm. I told everyone to be quiet and to think. We had 3 options. We could attempt to find another way out of the chamber system by exploring the second opening in the great chamber, the large one on the far side of the column that we had not entered. We could attempt to span the gap with anything we had available. Or we could go back to the great chamber and wait. None of those options were good. Exploring an unknown passage without a rope and without knowledge of where it led was dangerous in any circumstance, and extremely dangerous in this one. Spanning the gap required materials we did not have. Our ropes were in the pack that Red had been carrying, and the pack had been on the far side of the collapse when it happened, having been set down at the edge of the gap during a rest break. And waiting in the great chamber was not an option I could examine clearly without thinking about the damp trail across the chamber floor and what had left it. Jonas said there was a 4th option. He said we could shore up the passage on the near side of the collapse, the portion of the floor between our position and the great chamber that had not yet fallen, and he said this mattered because the shoring would slow any further collapse and give time for someone to go back to the surface and return with rope equipment. But he said this carefully, because he could see what I could see, which was that shoring up a floor section from above while something below it was actively pressing against it was not a task that would be completed quickly, and that the men who stayed to do it would be in the corridor when whatever was pressing against the floor from below continued pressing. He was describing himself volunteering to stay. That was what he was saying when he said it. I told him absolutely not. I told him we would find another way. I told him to start examining the gap edges for any structural alternative. It was during this examination that Red, who had moved back toward the great chamber entrance to give himself room to think, came back to tell us that the great chamber was occupied. He did not say occupied. He did not use that word. What he said was that the chamber was different. That the warmth coming from it had increased sharply in the past few minutes, and that the column was no longer visible from the corridor entrance in the same way it had been, and that when he had held his torch into the chamber opening, the shadows had not behaved the way they should have. He said the shadows had not moved away from the light. They had moved toward it. He said this in his flat, quiet way, the same tone he used to report water levels or rock quality, and I believed him completely because Red did not embellish and did not frighten easily, and the fact that his voice was carefully controlled in that moment told me more than if he had been shouting. The vibration in the floor surged, a single hard beat, much stronger than any that had preceded it, strong enough to feel in the knees rather than just the feet, strong enough that Corvin put out his hand to steady himself against the wall. And then it went back to its continuous pressure, but at a higher amplitude, and the heat from the great chamber entrance behind us increased sharply enough that I could feel it on the back of my neck from 30 feet away. I made my decision. I have to tell you the decision cleanly and without dressing it up, because I have spent 40 years dressing it up, and I am tired of it, and I am very nearly out of time to be tired of anything. I sent Jonas, Red, and Loy back to shore, the corridor floor, on the near side of the collapse, and to hold their position, while Corvin and I went into the great chamber to find the second exit. I told them that if we found it, and it led to the surface, Corvin would come back for them, and I would hold the exit. I told them they had maybe 40 minutes before the shoring work became untenable. I told them to time it carefully, and that if they did not hear from us in 35 minutes, they should use their own judgment about what to do next. Jonas looked at me for a long time. He looked at the disc in my pack, and I knew what he was seeing, and I knew what he was thinking. He was thinking that the decision had a different shape than I was describing it to have, and that the disc in my pack was part of that shape, and that the corridor they were being asked to shore up and hold was between the vibrating floor and whatever was in the chamber, and that shoring it up meant being between the two. He said, "Come back for us." I said that I would. Corvin and I went into the great chamber. I have to be honest about those next minutes, honest in a way I was not able to be for a very long time afterward. The great chamber was not as Red had described it. Red had been accurate. The shadows were different. The warmth was elevated. The column was not visible in the same way. But Red had not been able to see from where he stood in the corridor entrance what Corvin and I could see from inside the chamber, which was that the source of the changed shadow and the increased warmth was something behind the column, on the far side of it, in the direction of the large secondary opening that we had not entered. I could not see what was there. The column was between us and it. What I could perceive was indirect. The warmth was directed from that side of the column, pressing around its circumference, toward us in a way that was consistent with a source rather than ambient radiation. And the floor pulse was strongest on that side, the beat pressing up through the stone floor of the chamber in a pattern that was not uniform but concentrated, localized, as if the weight pressing from below was not distributed across the entire floor but positioned, the way footsteps are positioned, rather than the way geothermal heat is distributed. I did not go around the column. I want to be clear about this. I made the deliberate choice not to go around the column. I have asked myself, many times, whether that choice changed anything, whether seeing what was on the far side of it would have given me information that would have led to a different decision, whether there was something I could have done with that information that would have brought a different outcome for Jonas and Red and Loy. I do not know. I believe I knew, in the way a man knows things he cannot prove and cannot act on, that what was behind the column was the thing that the disc belonged to, the thing that had moved through the chamber while we were in the north corridor and left the damp trail across the floor, the thing whose pulse I had been feeling in my sternum for the past hour, and that going around the column to present myself to it while carrying its property in my pack was not a negotiation I was equipped to have. The second exit was on the near side of the column, in the western wall of the chamber. I saw it when I edged around the column's near side, a low archway, about 5 feet tall, that I had not noticed during our first visit, because it was cut from the same dark stone as the wall and the column, and could be missed if you were not looking directly at it. The passage beyond it sloped upward. I could feel cooler air coming from it, the first cool air I had felt since our initial descent, and the vibration in the floor was weaker in that direction, decreasing as I moved toward the archway. I grabbed Corvin's arm and pointed. We went through the archway at a run. The passage sloped upward for a long time, longer than I could measure in the moment, with the corridor's dressed stone walls continuing and then gradually giving way to natural rock as we ascended, the construction becoming rougher and then rougher still until we were in a natural fissure that required hands and knees to navigate, and then the fissure opened to the surface, a low gap in the base of the basin rock face, about 1.5 miles southwest of the main shaft. The sun was still up. We had been below for a little over 3 hours. I turned back immediately. Corvin grabbed my arm and I shook him off, and he grabbed it again, and I shook him off again, and he let me go. I ran the 1.5 miles in country that did not accommodate running, and I went back to the main shaft, and I called down into it for Jonas and Red and Loy, and nobody answered. I called several times. I used their names and then I used them together, and then I used each one separately, and I listened to the silence come back up out of the shaft, the way silence does when a space is empty of the thing you are calling for, that specific acoustic quality of unanswered absence. And while I was standing there at the edge of the shaft with my hands cupped around my mouth, the vibration came back through the ground, not just through the shaft, through the ground around it. A wide, sustained pulse that came up through the soles of my boots from the desert floor itself, and it was at the same rhythm as it had been underground, the same 2.5-second intervals, the same amplitude, as if the chamber system was not separate from the desert above it, but continuous with it, as if the floor of the basin was the roof of something very large that went very deep, and whatever moved in it moved through the whole of it. I made the decision to seal the shaft. I had the blasting powder in a kit that we kept in the camp stores, a small reserve for breaking calcite when the pickwork was going too slow. It was not enough to cause a significant structural collapse. What it was enough to do was to bring down the upper portion of the shaft, the first 8 feet of it, the natural rock above the calcite shelf line, and to do so in a way that would require significant effort to reopen, the kind of effort that would take days with the right equipment. It was not a burial. It was not a permanent sealing. It was a barrier. That is what I told myself. I went to the camp. I gathered the powder and the fuse. I came back to the shaft. I stood at the edge of the shaft for a long time before I set the charge. I was listening. I called down one more time and I waited a full minute, which is a very long minute when you are standing at the edge of a shaft with blasting powder in your hands, and the ground is vibrating under your feet. No answer. I set the charge and I went back 50 feet, and I covered my head with my arms, and the charge went, and the upper shaft collapsed cleanly inward, the pale calcite and desert rock filling the opening in a pile of rubble that would take better men than us several days to shift. And the vibration in the ground around the shaft stopped at the moment of the collapse, cut off as precisely as it had been in the corridor when the disc had been removed from its mount, stopped, and then simply absent, the desert floor quiet and still, and cold in the way desert rock should be cold in October. I walked back to where Corvin was and sat down. We did not speak for a very long time. The sun went down. The stars came out. The desert in October at that latitude is profoundly cold at night, and we had a fire, but neither of us moved to tend it in any particular way. We just let it burn and sat by it. I still had the disc. It was in my pack. I had not put it back in its mount. I had not placed it in the depression in the north chamber. I had not left it anywhere below. I had carried it through the archway exit. I had run back to the main shaft with it on my back, and I had sealed the shaft while it was still on my back. I thought about this for a long time that night, and I could not construct a clean account of why I had not left it below, except that every time the thought of leaving it had arisen, I had dismissed it, and I could not say now whether that dismissal had been my own or had been something else, something that had been in the disc since I pulled it from its mount, something that had made it easy to keep and difficult to put down, which was a possibility I was not willing to name then and am barely willing to name now. I want to say something about Jonas Pell and about Red and Loy that is not captured in the account of the events themselves. Jonas was the most methodical man I have ever worked with. He kept records of everything, the dates and depths of every survey, the rock quality assessments, the tool maintenance logs, the water consumption for the party, all of it in that cloth-bound notebook in his careful mason's hand. He was not a dramatic man, and he was not a philosophical man, but he understood structure in a way that was almost spiritual, the way a good carpenter understands wood, as something alive and opinionated, and he had extended that understanding to everything he encountered, including the corridor system below the Humboldt Basin, and including me, and he had told me plainly enough, in the way Jonas told things, that taking the disc was a mistake. He had been correct. Samuel Loy had 3 children that I knew of, though he spoke of family rarely. He was from somewhere in the Ohio country originally. He was the most careful man I have ever shared a camp with, methodical about water and food and equipment in a way that had saved the party from hardship more than once. And he had been right to say we should go back up the first time, and I should have listened to him. Thomas Red I knew less well, having met him only at the beginning of that survey season. What I know of him is that he was accurate, reliable, and not easily frightened, and that he had described the changed shadows in the great chamber in precisely the language a man with his qualities would use if he were being completely honest about what he had seen. I carried the disc out. I filed no report. I told no authority about the shaft, or the corridor system, or the chamber, or what happened to 3 men at the bottom of it. I told the men who asked, and not many asked, that the survey had been unproductive, and that 3 members of the party had been lost in a standard collapse incident, which was not entirely false if you were determined to be uncharitable about it. I did not sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch, for many years after that. I still do not. The ground in the night is not always quiet, and when it is quiet, I am aware of it as quiet, rather than just absent, which amounts to the same loss of rest. The disc has been in my possession since that day in October of 1802. I was 31 years old then. I am not going to tell you my age now because it does not matter, and because the number of years between that day and this recording is a number I am tired of carrying. What I will tell you is that the disc has never been cold. In 40 years of handling it, in storage, in transit, through winters that would freeze iron solid, it has never been cold. It is always warm, not hot. The same steady warmth it had when I pulled it from its mount in the great chamber, the warmth of something that is not ambient, that is not borrowed from its surroundings, but that originates from within itself. Whether that is a property of the obsidian, or of the channels cut into it, or of something else entirely, is a question I have not been able to answer and have mostly stopped pursuing. I am going to stop here and say what I believe happened at the bottom of that shaft, as clearly as I am able. I believe we entered a place that had been in continuous and deliberate use for a very long time before we arrived, and that its use was not random occupation, but something organized and maintained and specific, and that the things in it, the objects in the alcoves, the column, the depression in the north chamber floor, the disc in its mount in the great chamber, were in relationship with each other, and with whatever used the place, and that this relationship was not casual. I believe the pulse in the floor was what it felt like it was, which is to say, not a geological phenomenon, but the sign of something large and old, whose territory we had entered, and whose property we had taken. I believe it knew we were there from the moment we descended. I believe the warmth was the first response, and the vibration was the second, and the collapsed passages were the third. I believe Jonas and Red and Loy were not killed by a structural failure. I believe they were overtaken by something in the corridor that was working through the floor to reach the level above it. I believe the shoring was not what trapped them. I believe what trapped them was that I did not come back for them as I had said I would, because I found an exit and I took it, and I took it because I was carrying a disc that I should have left in its mount, the moment I understood that what was below the Humboldt Basin was not a cave, and not an abandoned structure, and not a mystery that would improve with the taking of a souvenir. Jonas looked at me when I said, "Come back for us." He said it as if he was not certain I would. He may have known, in the way Jonas knew things, what my actual choice was going to be before I had made it. I have lived with the question of whether his look was a reproach or just a request, and I have decided that it was both, and that the difference between those two things is smaller than I once believed. The disc is beside me as I give this recording. It is on the table next to the bed. It is warm. It has been warm every day for 40 years. When I press my fingers to its edge, the channels of the spiral pattern can be felt clearly under the fingertips, precise and deep and deliberate. The smell of rendered fat is still faintly present in the channels if you put your face close to it, which I have stopped doing, but which I did once, years ago, when I was trying to determine whether what I was smelling was genuine or memory. It was genuine, the same smell as in the chamber, as if whatever filled those channels has not evaporated and has not been absorbed, as if it is being replenished. I do not have an explanation for that. I have not had an explanation for it for 40 years. I am leaving the disc with this recording. It should go together. The person receiving this should understand that the disc is evidence, the only evidence that came out of the shaft east of the Humboldt, and that it is evidence not only of what we found below, but of the cost at which it was brought out. Jonas and Red and Loy went into the ground of that basin on the strength of my leadership and my decisions, and they did not come out. And the thing that was supposed to come back down into the ground with them, the thing that might have been the payment the whole situation was working toward, came out instead, in my pack, and is sitting warm on a table by a dying man who has earned every sleepless night he has been given. I have been asked, by the two people I told parts of this story to over the years, whether I regret going into the shaft at all. The answer is no. I regret what I took. I regret that I did not replace it before we came up the first time. I regret that I allowed Corvin's argument about documentation to override Loy's argument about retreat. I regret that when I found the western archway exit in the great chamber, I did not go back the way I had come, through the chamber and the south corridor and back to Jonas and the others, which would have required going around the column and presenting myself to whatever was behind it, with the disc still in my pack. That is what I should have done. It may have resolved nothing. It may have resolved everything. I will never know, and not knowing is the specific texture of what I am carrying. If there is anyone reading this who has any knowledge of the basin country east of the Humboldt Range, of any passage or opening or anomaly in the rock formations of that area, I am asking you to leave it alone, not out of fear of what might come out of it. I have no evidence that what is down there comes out. What I have evidence of is what goes into it and does not come back, and 3 of those things were men I was responsible for, and the only thing that came back from below that should have stayed below is sitting warm on a table next to me and smelling faintly of rendered fat, and it is the last thing I am going to see before I close my eyes. And I want it said plainly and on the record that I know exactly what it cost, and I have never once put it down willingly, and I have never been able to explain that either.